Something changed in the last 48 hours that the energy markets have not fully priced, that most Western newsrooms have not yet connected to the war's financial architecture, and that Vladimir Putin's inner circle is working very hard to keep off the front page. A Russian Shadow Fleet tanker, one of the vessels that forms the hidden financial backbone of this entire war, was intercepted, tracked, and effectively neutralized along one of the most critical, informal crude export corridors still functioning for the Kremlin. And I do not mean intercepted in a metaphorical sense. I mean physically stopped, documented, sanctioned in real time, and stripped of the operational cover that made the route viable for the ships moving behind it. Stay with me because the headline here is not the tanker, the headline is the route, and the route is not just a shipping lane, it is the mechanism by which Russia converts battlefield endurance into fiscal solvency. You take that route away, or even degrade it meaningfully, and the math of how long this war can sustain itself at current operational tempo begins to crack. Let me be very direct. Russia is not fighting this war on ideology alone. It is fighting it on oil revenue. And oil revenue in 2024 and now into the period we are analyzing does not flow primarily through transparent Western audited banking systems. It flows through a ghost infrastructure, aging tankers, falsified ownership records, parallel insurance schemes, port authorities with selective attention, and buyers who have decided that cheap Russian crude is worth the diplomatic headache. That is the Shadow Fleet. That is the system Ukraine and its partners just struck at the root. My name is Ben Hodges. I commanded the United States Army in Europe. I have spent decades studying how logistics and economics determine the outcome of wars that tacticians think are decided by firepower alone. By the time this video ends, you are going to understand not just what was intercepted and where, but why this particular interdiction points to a structural vulnerability in Russia's war economy that cannot be patched with a diplomatic phone call or a rerouted tanker. This is what a war of attrition actually looks like when the financial layer starts to fracture. Let me reconstruct what we know. The vessel in question, a tanker operating under the hallmarks of the Shadow Fleet, meaning flagged in a jurisdiction of convenience, insured outside the G7 framework, owned through a chain of shell companies that traces back to Russian or Russian-aligned beneficial owners, was operating along the corridor that runs through a combination of the Turkish Straits approach, the Eastern Mediterranean, and what industry trackers have identified as one of the most active informal transfer zones currently servicing Russian crude exports to secondary buyers in Asia and the Middle East. Watch this very carefully. The interdiction did not require a naval engagement. That is one of the most important tactical details here, and it is the one being most consistently underreported. The mechanism was a combination of things: intelligence sharing between Ukrainian partners and allied maritime enforcement agencies, the activation of enhanced port state controls in a jurisdiction that had previously looked the other way, and the simultaneous exposure, through commercial satellite imagery and financial forensics, of the vessel's true ownership chain and its connection to a sanctioned Russian energy entity. The ship stopped moving, not because it was sunk, because the port it was heading to suddenly became unavailable, and the port behind it became legally untenable, and the insurance backstop that should have covered the next leg of the voyage evaporated when the ownership connection became public. The tanker did not need to be destroyed. It needed to be made commercially non-viable, legally exposed, and geographically isolated. That is exactly what happened. Now, there is a second vessel connected to this corridor. Reports from maritime tracking platforms and geopolitical risk analysts indicate a companion tanker operating on essentially the same route was also flagged and is now under formal review by at least 2 jurisdictions. That means this was not a single intercept, it was an interdiction of the route architecture itself. And here is the number I want you to hold. Analysts tracking Russian Shadow Fleet operations estimate that the corridor affected here has been responsible for somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 barrels per day in Russian crude movement during peak operational periods. Let me say that again, 600,000 to 800,000 barrels per day. At even a conservative price of $60 per barrel, well below what secondary market buyers have been paying, that is between $36 and $48 million per day in gross revenue flowing through this one informal export architecture. Per day, not per month, per day. You do not have to be an economist to understand what it means when that corridor becomes unreliable. Stay with me because I want to move now from the maritime mechanics to the operational meaning, and this is where the analysis gets genuinely consequential. Russia's shadow fleet was never designed to be a permanent solution. It was designed to be a bridge. When Western sanctions cut off access to mainstream shipping insurance, mainstream port services, and mainstream financial clearing after February 2022, Russia's response was to build a parallel system. They bought aging tankers through intermediaries. They arranged insurance through non-G7 providers in countries like India and the UAE. They found ports in Turkey, in the Gulf, in parts of Southeast Asia that were willing to process Russian crude with a degree of studied ambiguity about where it came from and who owned the ships moving it. That system worked. For a time, it worked well enough that Russia's oil export revenues in 2023 actually recovered meaningfully from the immediate post-sanction shock. That recovery, that financial stabilization, is a significant part of why the war has continued at the operational tempo we have seen through 2024 and into the current period. The shadow fleet was not a footnote. It was a load-bearing wall in Russia's war finance architecture. What changes when you begin systematically degrading that wall? First, you create routing uncertainty. When a tanker operator or the entity behind the tanker operator cannot be confident that a specific corridor will be usable on a specific date, they have to build in contingency. Alternative routes are almost always longer, more expensive, and less efficient. The per-barrel cost of moving Russian crude goes up. That margin erosion may sound modest at the level of individual shipments, but across the volume we are talking about, it compounds very quickly into hundreds of millions of dollars in reduced net revenue per quarter. Second, and this is the variable that I think Western analysis has dramatically underweighted, you create behavioral risk aversion in the buyer community. The buyers of Russian crude operating through the shadow system are not ideological partners of the Kremlin. They are opportunists. They are buying cheap oil. The moment that cheap oil comes attached to legal exposure, port disruption risk, insurance complications, and the possibility of sanctioned secondary liability, the calculation changes. Some buyers pull back, others demand a steeper discount to compensate for the elevated risk. Either outcome reduces Russia's net revenue per barrel. The discount Russia is already forced to offer on its crude, often $15 to $25 below Brent, and gets wider under pressure. The financial case for the shadow fleet starts to erode from the buyer side simultaneously with pressure from the enforcement side. Watch this very carefully. That is a pincer. And Russia has no obvious answer to a pincer that operates simultaneously through legal enforcement, insurance disruption, buyer hesitation, and route interdiction. These are not military tools. They are systemic tools. And systemic tools do not produce a single dramatic headline. They produce cumulative degradation that is almost impossible to reverse quickly. Now let me take you to the broader pattern of related strikes and systems failures, because this maritime interdiction does not exist in isolation. It is one vector in what has become a genuinely multi-domain campaign against Russia's war-sustaining infrastructure. Consider what has happened in recent months alongside this shadow fleet pressure. Ukraine's deep strike campaign against Russian energy infrastructure, refineries, fuel storage, pipeline terminus facilities has not stopped. It has intensified and grown more precise. The Saratov refinery, the Ryazan facility, the Slavyansk facility in the occupied territories, strike after strike after strike against the nodes where Russian fuel is processed and distributed to frontline forces. Those strikes do two things simultaneously. They reduce the domestic refining capacity that Russia needs to supply its own military operations, and they reduce the volume of refined product that Russia can export as a higher margin alternative to raw crude. You are compressing the revenue picture from both ends. Let me say that again, because this is the kind of strategic geometry that does not fit in a 90-second news package, but is absolutely essential to understanding why the war looks the way it does right now. Ukraine is striking the production and refining nodes from the air, and now Ukraine and its partners are interdicting the export routes at sea. You cannot look at those two lines of effort as separate campaigns. They are the same campaign, operating across different domains, against the same target. Russia's ability to convert its hydrocarbon reserves into the fiscal revenue that funds the war machine. And there is a third vector that completes this picture: The G7 oil price cap mechanism, which capped Russian crude at $60 per barrel for Western service-eligible shipments, was always designed with exactly this kind of complementary enforcement in mind. The cap creates a legal architecture. Maritime interdictions enforce that architecture. Intelligence sharing fills the gaps the architecture cannot cover institutionally. When all three work together, the effect is not additive, it is multiplicative. The shadow fleet cannot easily operate when the route is exposed, the price cap creates legal risk for supporting services, and the underlying production facilities are being degraded by precision strikes. Stay with me, because I want to talk about what this exposes about Russian strategic assumptions, and this is where I move from the operational to the genuinely systemic. Russia built its entire economic war strategy on a set of assumptions that seemed defensible in early 2022 but have proven one by one to be structurally unsustainable. The first assumption was that European energy dependence would create irresistible political pressure to soften or lift sanctions. That assumption failed. Europe diversified faster and at greater economic pain than Moscow expected, and the political will in Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw held longer than the Kremlin's models predicted. The second assumption was that non-Western buyers, primarily in Asia, would absorb Russian crude at sufficient volume and price to compensate for the European exit. That assumption partially held, but only partially. India and China did increase purchases, but both extracted enormous discounts. The per-barrel revenue Russia receives from its largest remaining customers is substantially below what it received from European buyers before the war. The volume partially compensated. The margin did not. The third assumption, and this is the one the shadow fleet was designed to sustain, was that informal export infrastructure could be built and scaled faster than Western enforcement could track and degrade it. That assumption is now failing, and it is failing not because Western governments suddenly developed a political will they previously lacked, but because the tools of enforcement, satellite tracking, financial forensics, beneficial ownership databases, insurance market pressure, have matured and been deliberately targeted at exactly this problem. Watch this very carefully. When all three of Russia's economic war assumptions fail simultaneously, you do not get a gradual budget adjustment. You get a fiscal crisis that compounds with the existing pressure from the military operational budget, the social welfare commitments the Kremlin has made to maintain domestic political stability, and the cost of replacing materiel losses that are running at a rate Russia's defense industrial base cannot fully sustain. The Russian federal budget is already operating at a structural deficit that requires drawdowns from the National Wealth Fund at a pace that was not originally planned. The finance ministry has signaled discomfort. The central bank has been forced to maintain extraordinarily high interest rates. We are talking about benchmark rates in the range of 16 to 21% depending on the period, specifically to contain inflationary pressure driven by war spending. That is not the fiscal posture of a country that has found a sustainable financial equilibrium. That is the posture of a country running a managed crisis and hoping the war ends before the management becomes untenable. Now let me turn to the diplomatic and NATO-level consequences of this interdiction, because they matter enormously for understanding what happens next. The countries whose port jurisdictions and financial systems have been implicated in shadow fleet facilitation are not enemy states. They are partners, non-aligned actors, and in some cases NATO-adjacent countries whose cooperation is essential to the broader Western strategic posture. When an interdiction exposes specific jurisdictions as shadow fleet transit points, it creates diplomatic friction that the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union have to manage carefully. Turkey is the most important example. The Turkish Straits remain a critical choke point for Russian naval and commercial traffic in and out of the Black Sea. Ankara has calibrated its position throughout this conflict with extraordinary precision, maintaining economic relationships with Moscow while supporting Ukrainian sovereignty and occasionally facilitating Western diplomatic efforts. The pressure on Turkey to more aggressively enforce Montreux Convention provisions or to apply stricter port state controls to shadow fleet vessels is real and growing, but it comes with countervailing pressures from Turkish economic interests and Ankara's desire to remain an indispensable interlocutor rather than a partisan actor. The same dynamic plays out to varying degrees in the UAE, in India, and in several Southeast Asian jurisdictions that have become nodes in the informal Russian energy export system. The diplomatic work of tightening these jurisdictions is slow, unglamorous, and frequently invisible in news coverage, but it is among the most strategically consequential work happening in this war right now. Let me say that again. The diplomatic effort to close shadow fleet corridors is not less important than the military effort on the front line. In some ways, it is more important because it operates on the fiscal foundation that determines how long the front line can be sustained at all. On the NATO side, this interdiction highlights something that alliance defense ministers have been discussing with increasing urgency: the need for a dedicated maritime enforcement capacity that goes beyond traditional naval operations and integrates financial intelligence, commercial satellite data, and port state control mechanisms in a coordinated framework. NATO's current posture is strong on conventional deterrence. It is weaker on the kind of gray zone economic warfare interdiction that the Shadow Fleet challenge demands. That gap needs to close, and this incident is likely to accelerate the internal discussions about how. From a war industry perspective, the implications are equally significant. Russia's defense industrial base is running at a wartime production tempo that requires continuous revenue to sustain. The munitions, the armored vehicles, the aircraft, the drones, all of it requires fiscal fuel. The revenue shortfalls created by refined infrastructure strikes, shadow fleet disruption, and buyer-side margin compression do not stop the factories immediately. But they force prioritization decisions. They force the finance ministry to argue with the defense ministry about allocation. They create internal friction in the planning process that slows adaptation and creates delays in fielding new systems. Ukraine's defense industrial base, by contrast, is scaling with Western support, deepening integration with NATO supplier networks, and benefiting from the kind of long-term production commitments that the Brussels Defense Production Act framework and equivalent US and British programs are generating. The trajectory lines are moving in opposite directions, and the Shadow Fleet interdiction is one of the mechanisms widening that divergence. Stay with me, because I want to move to the forecast layer and I want to be precise about what I think the next 30 to 60 days look like given everything I have laid out. The first watch point is the response behavior of the remaining active Shadow Fleet corridors. Russia will attempt to reroute. That is certain. They will try to identify alternative transit points, establish new informal port relationships, and reconstruct the ownership chains that were exposed in this interdiction. The question is how quickly the enforcement and intelligence apparatus that produced this interdiction can track and respond to those adaptations. History suggests the adaptation cycle on the Russian side is slower than Moscow would like, and the enforcement cycle on the Western side is faster than Moscow expected. But we should not assume this is a one-and-done interdiction. It is the opening of a sustained campaign. The second watch point is the response of secondary buyers. If India, China, or other significant purchasers of Russian crude begin to signal, even informally, that the legal and reputational risk of Shadow Fleet involvement is becoming uncomfortable, that will appear in the discount data before it appears in any official statement. Watch the per-barrel discount on Russian crude relative to Brent very carefully over the next 4 to 6 weeks. A widening discount is the market's way of saying that Russian crude is becoming more dangerous to handle. That is the signal that the interdiction campaign is working at scale. The third watch point is the Russian domestic fiscal picture. The next set of budget figures from Moscow, to the extent they are released with any transparency, which is increasingly not the case, will tell us whether the National Wealth Fund drawdowns are accelerating. If they are, the fiscal pressure on the war machine is real and compounding. If they appear to stabilize, it may mean Russia has found alternative revenue streams or is simply not publishing accurate data, which itself is an indicator of political stress. Watch this very carefully. The fourth watch point is the diplomatic signaling from Ankara, Abu Dhabi, and New Delhi. If any of these three capitals begins to quietly tighten port state controls or reduce the operational space for Shadow Fleet transit, the route architecture degrades significantly faster than it would through Western enforcement alone. None of these countries wants to be publicly seen as enforcing Western sanctions. That is not the diplomatic position they have chosen, but all three have shown the ability to create administrative friction that produces the same practical effect without the formal commitment. Watch for that friction in vessel processing times, insurance documentation requirements, and port scheduling. My strategic verdict is this: what happened here is not a tactical interdiction. It is a systemic stress test of the financial architecture Russia built to sustain a long war. The architecture is failing the test, not catastrophically, not immediately, but directionally and at an accelerating pace. The Kremlin built its endurance strategy on three pillars: energy revenue, reserve funds, and the assumption that Western resolve would erode before Russian fiscal capacity did. The first pillar is under multi-domain attack from above and at sea. The second pillar is being drawn down at an unsustainable rate. The third pillar, Western resolve, has not eroded in the way Moscow predicted. It has, if anything, deepened its institutional expression through NATO expansion, long-term defense production commitments, and exactly the kind of sophisticated economic warfare interdiction we are discussing today. I have spent a career studying what happens when a military power's strategic assumptions prove wrong at the same time its logistical architecture comes under sustained attack. It is not pretty, and it does not resolve quickly or cleanly, but it does resolve. The question for the next phase of this war is not whether Russia's fiscal military system is under fatal stress. It clearly is. The question is whether Ukraine and its partners can maintain the multi-domain pressure long enough and with enough coordination to convert that stress into a strategic outcome before domestic political timelines in Western capitals create the pressure for a negotiated off-ramp that locks in Russian gains. That is the race that matters right now. And the Shadow Fleet interdiction you heard about in today's headlines is a data point in that race that deserves far more strategic weight than it is currently receiving. Stay with this story. The next development could come within days, and when it does, I will be right here to break down what it means and why it matters. If you found this analysis useful, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. I read them, and the question I want to leave you with is this: do you think Western enforcement of the Shadow Fleet corridors can sustain the pace and coordination this campaign requires? Tell me what you think. I will see you in the next one.